close your eyes for a second and picture Jesus Christ. What do you see? Pale skin, blue eyes, flowing brown hair, a European face staring back at you from 1,000 paintings, 1,000,000 Sunday school illustrations, 1,000,000,000 stained glass windows. Now open your eyes. Because everything you just imagined is a lie. The man who walked on water, who raised the dead, who claimed to be the Son of God, he didn't look anything like those paintings. Not even close. And the reason you believe he did is because of the greatest cover-up in human history. A cover-up that erased his grandmother's African blood. A cover-up that painted over his ancestors' dark skin. A cover-up that transformed a brown-skinned Afro-Levantine man into a European prince. And tonight, you're going to discover why they did it. Who ordered it. How they accomplished it. And what it means for everything you've ever been taught about Christianity. Because hidden in the pages of the Bible itself, buried in genealogies that pastors skip over, concealed in family trees that scholars refuse to discuss, there's a truth so explosive that for 2,000 years, the most powerful institutions on earth have worked to make sure you never found it. Jesus Christ carried African blood. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. Literally. His great-great-grandmother was African. His grandmother was African. The women who carried the royal bloodline into his veins came from the same lands, the same peoples, the same ancestry as the continent of Africa. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why they needed you to never know that. Because if you knew the truth about Jesus' bloodline, it would shatter everything you've been taught about race, about power, about who gets to claim the legacy of the Bible itself. Are you ready? Because this is the story they never wanted you to hear. Let's start with a simple question. Why do all those famous paintings show Jesus as a white European? The answer isn't religious. It's political. And it's darker than you could possibly imagine. Starting in the 13th century, European artists began recreating biblical figures in their own image. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't artistic license. It was a deliberate, calculated strategy to consolidate power. Think about it. If you're a European monarch in the 1400s claiming divine right to rule, what do you need? You need the heroes of the Bible to look like you. You need Moses, David, Solomon, and especially Jesus to reflect your image. Because if they look like you, then you can claim their authority, their legitimacy, their divine mandate. The Vatican understood this. European royal families understood this. And together, they commissioned thousands of paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and stained glass windows, all depicting biblical figures as European royalty. By the 1600s, it was so widespread that nobody questioned it anymore. The lie had become the truth. And the truth had been buried so deep that even today, 2,000 years later, most people have no idea what Jesus actually looked like. But the evidence never disappeared. It's still there. Hidden in plain sight. In the genealogies. In the archaeology. In the DNA. And we're about to uncover all of it. Let's trace the bloodline. Because this is where the cover-up starts to crack. The Bible tells us exactly who Jesus' ancestors were. It's right there in the Gospel of Matthew. Chapter 1. Verse by verse. Name by name. A complete family tree stretching from Abraham all the way to Joseph, Jesus' legal father. But here's what they don't want you to notice. Among those names, hidden in that genealogy, are women. And not just any women. Foreign women. Women whose ancestry changes everything. Let's start with Ruth. Ruth the Moabitess. You've probably heard her story. The loyal daughter-in-law who followed Naomi back to Israel. Beautiful tale of devotion. But here's what they don't emphasize. The Bible calls her the Moabitess over and over again. Not just Ruth. Ruth the Moabitess. Why does that matter? Because Moab wasn't in Europe. It was a kingdom located in what's now Jordan, directly east of the Dead Sea. And the Moabites were an Afro-Asiatic people with deep connections to northeastern Africa. Now you might be thinking, Jordan is in the Middle East, not Africa. True. But here's what modern anthropology tells us. The ancient Near East wasn't divided the way we think of it today. There was constant migration, trade, and intermarriage between northeastern Africa and the Levant. The Moabites had significant African ancestry. Studies of ancient Moabite remains show cranial features consistent with Afro-Saharan populations. Their pottery styles match North African patterns. Their language belongs to the Afro-Asiatic family, the same linguistic family that includes ancient Egyptian and Cushitic languages. Ruth wasn't European. She wasn't even what we'd call Middle Eastern in the modern sense. She was an Afro-Levantine woman. And she's Jesus's great-great-grandmother. But it doesn't stop there. Go further back in the genealogy and you find Rahab, the woman who helped the Israelite spies in Jericho. According to Matthew's Gospel, she's also Jesus's ancestor. Rahab was a Canaanite. And the Canaanites have been heavily studied by archaeologists. Here's what we know. Ancient Canaan was a melting pot. It sat at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. And archaeological evidence shows significant African influence throughout ancient Canaanite culture. Recent DNA studies from burial sites in ancient Canaan show genetic markers consistent with northeastern African populations. Trade records show extensive contact with Nubian kingdoms to the south. Artistic depictions on Canaanite pottery show dark-skinned figures with African features. The Canaanites weren't a monolithic white civilization. They were diverse. And a significant portion of them had African roots. Rahab was one of those people. And she's in Jesus's bloodline. But wait. There's more. Even further back, we find Tamar. Her story is complicated, but genealogically she's a direct ancestor through Judah's line. And recent archaeology reveals that the Levant during the Bronze Age had significant populations of dark-skinned Afro-Levantine peoples. DNA extracted from teeth and bones at ancient sites shows genetic markers linking these populations to northeastern and eastern Africa. We're talking about the same people who would later become part of the tribes of Israel. So let's add this up. Jesus's great-great-great-grandmother Tamar. Afro-Levantine heritage. His great-great-grandmother Rahab. Canaanite with African ancestry. His great-grandmother Ruth. Moabitess with African blood. This isn't speculation. This isn't theory. This is what the Bible itself documents if you actually read it carefully. And it means one devastating thing for everyone who ever painted Jesus as a pale-skinned European. The bloodline that led to Jesus Christ was never purely Middle Eastern. It was mixed, blended, Afro-Levantine. And that changes everything. Now let's talk about King David. Because this is where the cover-up gets even more obvious. Every painting you've ever seen of David shows a pale-skinned European warrior with flowing blonde hair. A Renaissance prince in royal robes. But here's what nobody tells you. David was a direct descendant of Ruth the Moabitess. She was his grandmother. Which means David himself carried African blood. And it shows in how the Bible describes him. The Hebrew word used to describe David's appearance is admoni. Some translate it as ruddy or reddish. But here's what scholars know. Admoni describes a reddish-brown complexion. Not pale pink. Reddish-brown. The kind of complexion you see in northeastern African populations. David wasn't white. He was brown-skinned. Probably dark brown. With hair that the archaeology of his era tells us was likely black and tightly coiled. And the evidence doesn't stop with the text. In 1993, archaeologists found a stone fragment at Tel Dan in northern Israel. Carved into it in ancient Aramaic are the words House of David. One of the earliest non-biblical references to David's dynasty. But here's what's fascinating. The archaeological context around that inscription tells us a lot about what the people of that time actually looked like. The pottery styles found at the site match North African and Nubian patterns. The metallurgy techniques show influence from Cushite kingdoms to the south. Even the architectural styles have parallels with ancient Sudanese construction methods. This wasn't a European civilization. Not even close. Excavations in the city of David, the original fortress that King David conquered, have uncovered thousands of artifacts. Seal impressions showing faces with broad noses and full lips. Hair depicted in tight curls or locks. Features that archaeologists describe as Afro-Levantine. Jewelry discovered in Judahite tombs shows design patterns that match those found in ancient Nubia and Sudan. The same bead styles. The same metalwork techniques. The same aesthetic preferences. And then there's the DNA. A 2020 study analyzing remains from Iron Age Judah found markers consistent with East African and North African ancestry. These weren't outliers. This was the general population. The people who lived in Judah during David's time had significant genetic overlap with populations from northeastern Africa. Wall paintings and pottery from the period show human figures with dark skin tones. Not occasionally. Regularly. It was the norm, not the exception. Even the Assyrian reliefs showing the conquest of Judahite cities depict the people of Judah with darker skin, broader features, and tight curly hair. The kingdom of Judah in David's time was not European. The people were not white. The culture had strong connections to northeastern Africa. And David, the man after God's own heart, the greatest king of Israel, the ancestor of the Messiah, he was an Afro-Levantine king with African blood flowing through his veins. But if David carried African ancestry, and Jesus was a direct descendant of David, then what does that tell us about Jesus? It tells us what they never wanted you to know. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was a direct descendant of King David. The genealogy is traced explicitly. David to Solomon. Solomon to Rehoboam. All the way down through the kings of Judah to Joseph, Jesus' legal father. Luke's Gospel traces a similar line going back through David to Abraham. So if David carried African ancestry, then so did his descendants. All of them. Including Jesus. This isn't optional. It's right there in the text. Ruth the Moabitess's blood flows through the generations. Rahab the Canaanite's heritage continues down the line. The Afro-Levantine ancestry of ancient Judah doesn't disappear just because it makes people uncomfortable. Blood doesn't lie. And here's what's fascinating. Early Christian art from Africa, from Ethiopia, from Egypt, from Nubia, depicted Jesus with African features. Dark skin. Curly black hair. Features that reflected their own populations. Were they wrong? Or were they actually closer to the historical truth than the European paintings that came later? Think about it. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. He grew up in Nazareth. He lived his entire life in the Levant. He was a descendant of Judah's royal line. And that line carried significant African ancestry. The idea that Jesus was pale-skinned with straight brown hair, that's not historical. That's Renaissance fan fiction. The real Jesus would have looked like a man from the ancient Levant. Brown skin. Afro-Levantine features. A son of David's house. And David's house was an Afro-Levantine house. So why did they change him? Why did they transform a brown-skinned African-blooded man into a blue-eyed European? The answer is about to make you very, very angry. Let's go back to the 19th century. The height of European colonialism. European powers were carving up Africa, enslaving its people, and justifying it all with racial pseudoscience. And one of the ways they justified it was by claiming that Africans had no significant role in biblical history. Think about the logic. If you could prove that the heroes of the Bible were European, or at least non-African, then you could argue that God favored white people. That Europeans were the chosen ones. That colonialism was divinely ordained. Sounds insane, right? But this was mainstream academic thinking in the 1800s. Scholars went back through historical records and systematically reinterpreted anything that suggested African involvement in biblical history. They downplayed Egypt's role. They ignored Nubian connections. They erased the obvious African ancestry of key biblical figures. And it worked. By the early 20th century, the standard interpretation of biblical history had become completely Europeanized. Textbooks taught that ancient Israel was a Caucasian civilization. Museums displayed models of ancient Israelites with pale skin and European features. Hollywood cast white actors to play biblical characters. But here's the thing, this wasn't based on evidence. It was based on ideology. The Vatican had commissioned Renaissance artwork depicting biblical figures as Europeans for centuries. Those images became iconic. Changing them would mean admitting that the Church had been wrong for hundreds of years. European royal families had built their legitimacy on claims of descent from biblical kings. If those kings turned out to be African, that undermined their entire claim to power. And then there's the justification of slavery. If Jesus had African blood, if David had African blood, if the entire royal line of Judah carried African ancestry, then how could anyone argue that Africans were cursed? How could anyone use the Bible to justify enslaving people who shared ancestry with the Messiah himself? They couldn't. So they erased it. They painted over it. They rewrote the history books. They created an entire false image of what ancient Israel, and Jesus, really looked like. And the consequences were devastating. For centuries, African people were told that Christianity was a white man's religion, that the Bible had nothing to do with them, that the heroes of faith looked nothing like them. But it was all a lie. A calculated, deliberate, politically motivated lie designed to justify oppression and consolidate power. And the truth was right there in the Bible the whole time. In the genealogies, they told you to skip. In the ancestry, they hoped you'd never trace. So what did Jesus actually look like? Based on everything we now know from archaeology, anthropology, genetics, and the biblical text itself, let's paint the real picture. First, skin tone. The ancient Levant sits at a latitude similar to northern Africa. The sun is intense. People spent most of their time outdoors. Based on analysis of ancient remains and artistic depictions, Jesus would have had skin ranging from olive brown to dark brown. Not pale. Not white. Brown. Hair. Archaeological evidence shows that many Judahites wore their hair in locks or braided styles. The same hairstyles found throughout ancient Africa. Dreadlock-style hair appears in Egyptian art, Nubian sculptures, and Cushite depictions. So picture Jesus with dark, tightly coiled hair. Possibly in locks. Not flowing brown waves. Facial features. Ancient seals and artwork from Judah show faces with broad noses, full lips, and strong brows. These aren't European features. They're Afro-Levantine features. A 2019 anthropological study analyzing skeletal remains from Iron Age Judah found cranial measurements consistent with northeastern African populations. The researchers concluded that ancient Judahites had significant morphological overlap with ancient Cushite and Egyptian populations. In plain English, they looked more like Ethiopians and Sudanese than like Europeans. So here's the real image of Jesus Christ. A man of about 5 feet 5 inches, average height for that time and place. Brown skin, probably medium to dark brown. Black, tightly curled hair, possibly styled in the traditional manner of his people. Broad-nosed. Full-lipped. Weathered from years of walking under the Middle Eastern sun. Not a pale European with blue eyes and flowing hair. An Afro-Levantine Jewish man who would have blended in perfectly with the brown-skinned population of first-century Judea. And his ancestors, Ruth, Rahab, Tamar, David, they looked like him. Brown. African-blooded. Afro-Levantine. This is the Jesus that history erased. This is the Jesus that paintings covered up. This is the Jesus they never wanted you to see. Because if you saw him, really saw him, everything would change. Now here's the question nobody wants to answer. If this information is right there in the Bible, if the genealogies clearly show African ancestry, if the archaeology confirms it, if the DNA proves it, why isn't it taught? Why do Sunday schools still show European Jesus? Why do movies still cast white actors? Why do churches still hang Renaissance paintings on their walls? Because the lie serves too many purposes. It maintains power structures that have existed for centuries. It preserves the myth of European superiority. It keeps people from asking uncomfortable questions about race, religion, and the true origins of their faith. But the truth can't be buried forever. It's in the genealogies they skip over. It's in the archaeology they ignore. It's in the DNA that doesn't lie. Jesus Christ carried African blood. That's not a theory. That's not speculation. That's what the evidence shows when you actually look at it without bias. And if that bothers you, if that makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself why. Because the truth is the truth whether it fits your worldview or not. Here's what this means for you. For everyone. When you erase someone's ancestry, you're not just changing their skin color in a painting. You're stealing their history. Denying their heritage. Telling them they don't belong in a story that's rightfully theirs. For centuries, African people were told that the Bible wasn't their story. That Jesus wasn't their savior, at least not in any personal ancestral way. That Christianity was something brought to them by European colonizers. But the truth is the exact opposite. The Bible has always been an African story too. Not just, but too. Abraham came from Mesopotamia but traveled through African trade routes. Moses was raised in Egypt, an African civilization. The Israelites spent formative centuries in Africa. Ruth, Rahab, and Tamar brought African blood into the royal line. And Jesus, the central figure of Christianity, descended from all of them. This isn't about taking anything away from anyone. It's about restoring what was stolen. It's about telling the truth. The kingdom of Judah was an African-influenced civilization. Its greatest king carried African blood. Its Messiah carried African blood. And that legacy belongs to everyone, but especially to those whose ancestors were erased from the story. Early African Christians in Ethiopia, Egypt, and Nubia knew this. They painted Jesus with dark skin because that's what their traditions told them he looked like. They weren't guessing. They were preserving a memory that European Christianity tried to destroy. And now, in the 21st century, with new archaeological methods, with DNA analysis, with African scholars finally getting a voice in these discussions, the truth is coming out. The cover-up is crumbling. And it's about time. So what are you going to do with this knowledge? You've seen the genealogies. You've heard the evidence. You understand the cover-up. The man who billions worship as the Son of God carried African blood. His grandmother was African. His ancestors were African. His appearance was Afro-Levantine, not European. And for 2,000 years, the most powerful institutions in the world worked to make sure you never knew that. They commissioned paintings. They wrote textbooks. They built museums. They made movies. All depicting a false image. All perpetuating a lie. But the Bible itself preserved the truth. In the genealogies. In the names they couldn't erase. Ruth the Moabitess. Rahab the Canaanite. David the son of Jesse, grandson of Ruth. They could paint over the faces. But they couldn't change the text. And now you know. Jesus Christ was not the pale-skinned, blue-eyed European you saw in church. He was a brown-skinned, Afro-Levantine Jewish man. A descendant of African women. A carrier of African blood. And that truth, that simple documented biblical truth, changes everything. It changes how we understand Christianity. It changes who gets to claim that legacy. It changes the entire narrative about race, power, and divine favor that European institutions built over the last 1,000 years. If the Messiah himself carried African blood, then the story of the Bible has always been an African story too. Not just European. Not just Middle Eastern. African. And that's what they never wanted you to know. The paintings lied. The textbooks lied. The institutions lied. But the blood doesn't lie. The genealogies don't lie. The archaeology doesn't lie. The DNA doesn't lie. And now, neither do you. Because you know the truth. The truth they tried to bury. The truth they tried to paint over. The truth they tried to erase for 2,000 years. Jesus Christ carried African blood. And no painting, no textbook, no institution can ever change that again. The truth is out. And it changes everything.